For Polity in Johannesburg, I'm Darlene Creamer. Editor, poet, businessman and author Kaizer Nyatsumba is with me to discuss his book, Corporate Newsman, A Life of Integrity. This inspiring story is a chronicle of a man's journey in overcoming adversity to attain significant professional and academic success. To begin, may I ask you to take us back to your early years, when you were born in your parents' mud house on a farm in White River, located in the former Eastern Transvaal.
Yes, Darlene, thank you very much for the opportunity to chat to you. My parents were laborers. My father was a laborer, my mother was a domestic worker as I grew up, and I grew up on a farm. I spent a lot of time there, and we subsisted on maize meal. So pap was what we ate, pap with milk, pap with fish, pap with different things. Life was tough. We went to school when school time started without shoes. It was tough. And we were able to survive to get to the stage where one is at the moment, notwithstanding the very tough background one has had from a farm at White River, living at Ngotwana, and living just outside White River, going to a secondary school in the area.
You excelled during your school years, and your academic accomplishments led you to the United States, where you studied at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Could you share your experiences, including you confronting U.S. political commentator DeRoy Murdoch during his visits to the university when he came to speak about South Africa?
Yes, thank you very much. I was fortunate, thanks to one's hard work and one's ability to excel academically, to get a scholarship to the USA, something that I had never ever imagined would happen. But while I was at the University of Zululand, I saw an advertisement in the Mercury that I went on later to be deputy editor of, announcing this scholarship and calling on people interested to apply. And I applied, I was interviewed, I sat for the scholastic aptitude tests, as well as the English as a foreign language. The scholastic aptitude test, SATs, is something that everybody entering university in the US has to take. But people who are foreigners, for whom English is not the first language, are additionally required to take the TOEFL test of English as a foreign language. And again, I excelled in both exams, and I ended up being admitted at 3 top universities, at Dartmouth College, Brandeis University, and Georgetown University. And I had to choose. After having taken advice from my lecturer, Birgit Roberts, who had studied at Yale University, and he had placed me in contact with an American lecturer, Donna Schweitzer, at the university, who lectured library science. I then chose Georgetown University, the oldest Catholic university in the USA, for a number of reasons, among them being the fact that it is in the capital of that country. In my early months at the university, in fact, in a matter of weeks, shortly after the university reopened in 1985, I was sitting in my room and listening to the Georgetown University student radio. And I heard somebody speak about how during the May to September holidays, he had led a group of Americans to South Africa. And they described it very differently from the South Africa that I'd left behind. He was an African-American person, and he said there really wasn't anything untoward going on in South Africa. Black South Africans were not as badly treated as the news reported. I was upset at this. I left my room and went to the place where the broadcast was taking place, and I found it was actually a student who was in his final years, Jeroy Murdoch. And he went on to talk about how wonderfully he and others who were members of the Young Americans for Freedom had been treated in South Africa. The YAF Young Americans for Freedom is the youth wing of the Republican Party. And I then took him head on in front of everybody. I indicated that the picture he had painted was not accurate. Things were in fact getting worse in South Africa. The South Africa that I had left behind had just had a state of emergency declared. Violence was taking place in the different townships, and the police were everywhere in the townships. And so I indicated that he had just misled everybody. It may well be that because he was an African American, he had received special treatment in South Africa, but the picture he had painted to the student body was not accurate. And that confrontation led to me being well known on the campus in a matter of weeks, and went on then to do a number of exciting things. But that's what happened that led to the confrontation with DeRay Murdoch. People obviously believed somebody who had just emerged from the situation, as opposed to somebody who was American, conservative, and had visited here and had received honorary white treatment.
Your career in journalism eventually saw you become South Africa's first black editor of a mainstream newspaper. Please speak about your time at The Star, where you were political editor, including your interactions with ANC leader Chris Hani.
Darlene, I was fortunate to have been appointed the very first Black African political reporter on a mainstream newspaper, just shortly after W. de Klerk had announced the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990. Amin Akadwaya had been the first Black political reporter on the Rand Daily Mail. He's Indian. I was the first Black African person to report on politics on a mainstream newspaper, The Star. I went on to become political correspondent and political editor. And indeed, during that period, I interacted with everybody across the political spectrum, from the National Party leadership to the ANC leadership to the Pan-Africanist Congress to AZAPO. I was respected for having covered equally everybody, and for my political commentary that was recognized to be very, very even-handed. I also was fortunate to be offered an opportunity by Jill Marcus, who was then the spokesperson of the ANC, to interview Chris Hani shortly after his return from exile. So I was the first journalist in South Africa then to meet Chris Hani. We drove around the city of Johannesburg, we went to Braamfontein, where the driver from The Star and my colleague, the late Alf Khumalo, legendary photographer, was with me taking pictures as I interviewed Chris Hani. We went to Braamfontein, then went to the Carlton Center, and then Alf suggested that perhaps it would be better for us to get out of the car and take a walk so that you would have better opportunity to take greater pictures of Chris Hani as opposed to doing so in the car. And Chris, together with his comrade, agreed. The comrade in question was one Tokyo Sekwale, who was introduced to us. I did not know him, and I therefore described him in the articles that I wrote as a bodyguard for Chris Hani, and it turned out, in fact, he was not. He was anything but a bodyguard. Yes, on that occasion, he offered protection to Chris, but Chris was a comrade of his. And as we know, Tokyo Sekwale went on to be the first premier of Gauteng. And in 1993, on the 10th of April, when Chris Hani was murdered, Tokyo Sekwale was the first on the ground. So I got to know Chris very well, became great friends with him. And he was my guest at FNB Stadium whenever the national team played against Zambia and other countries in the African Cup of Nations qualifiers. And on the day he was murdered, I was due to host him at Rand Stadium, where South Africa was due to play against Mauritius in an African Cup of Nations qualifier.
You also spent time with Nelson Mandela. You recount a poignant story of how during a shared lunch, Mandela poured orange juice for everyone at the table, leaving very little for himself. Please tell us more about your relationship with Madiba, including the touching memory of the phone call you received from him following an unfortunate incident at the Eastgate Mall.
Darlene, thank you very much. Madiba was an amazing man. amazing man. And before I come to the experiences about which you have spoken, I need to indicate that before that, I had a fallout with Madiba in a big way. I have always been known to speak my mind, to be independently minded. On one occasion, I took Madiba on in a column and I criticized him. And on the Sunday Star, John Kodane did the same on a different matter. And the editor of City Press, Kulusubia, did the same. And this did not sit well with Madiba at a time when everybody was praising him. And he went around criticizing us without naming us, talk about 3 senior black journalists. And that concerned me because, he was almost a demigod. And the possibility that some of his supporters could attack us was very, very real. So I then called Matthew Sposa and asked him to broker a meeting between Madiba and myself. And Matthew Sposa did so. At the meeting where Kodane, Kulusubia, and myself were present, other black editors were also invited. And we were able to get a major concession agreed to that being a journalist will lead to occasions when one will say things that will not sit well with the leadership. That does not mean one does not mean well or that one is an enemy. And so on that day, Paulo Jordan and I were on the SABC, and when everything when we told the nation about how the meeting had gone. After that event, he invited the 3 of us, John Kolane, Kulusubia, and myself, to a dinner when he was hosting a visiting president as a real opportunity to signal that everything was behind us, that we were making a fresh start. And I also had the opportunity, as you indicated, to be invited as the only South African journalist to spend a day with Madiba as president. Also present was a journalist from the New York Times, John Kaizer, who went on to be editor of the New York Times. So the 2 of us met Madiba at the military airport in Pretoria, and we flew with him, sat with him from Wonderboom Airport through to Cape Town. Were transported with him and spent the whole day in his office, watching him interact with different ministers, with different people, take calls. And only twice were we asked to leave when he had a briefing with Deputy Presidents F.W. de Klerk and Thabo Mbeki, and when he was briefed on the situation in Lesotho, which was very tense at the time. And at lunchtime, he did something that deeply touched me. We were offered lunch, and there was a jug of juice, and he personally poured juice for us. I think it was orange juice for me and for Keda, and then filled our glasses to the brim, and there was very little juice left for him when he poured himself. There was half a glass of juice left. And when we protested at this, he said, no, it's fine. And that's what he then drank that day. It was touching that Madiba, a head of state, would not only spend the day with us, but also starve himself of juice at lunchtime, just to make sure that we journalists who were his guests for the day were well taken care of. And then when I was editor of the Independent on Saturday in Durban, I went to Eastgate to see my aunt who worked there, and I was harassed by security officers from Baron Security, very badly harassed in front of everybody. And I took great exception to this, and I wrote about it, and I sued the company. Now, Madiba heard about what had happened at Eastgate Mall, and as I was driving, passing Howick, driving to my hometown in White River, a call came through. A lady indicated that Madiba was on the line to talk to me. I was shocked. And as I took the phone to speak, it was indeed Madiba, and I pulled off the road and I spoke to him. And he told me how deeply sorry he was about what had happened to me, and indicated that I was doing the right thing by taking them on, and he wished me the very best of luck. I was incredibly deeply touched. I had read about Madiba calling people at a moment when they were dealing with tough situations. So it was the first time it happened to me, and I was very deeply touched. He was an amazing man.
As you reflect on your life's journey, including your time as the head of the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa and business, which moments or lessons have left the most lasting impressions?
Well, thank you very much, Darlene. Post-journalism, I went into business. I worked at Anglo American. I worked at Coca-Cola South Africa. I worked at Sasol Limited, all major listed companies. And then I worked for PetroSA, the only time I worked for a state-owned enterprise on a contractual basis. Then I was appointed CEO of the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa, SIFSA in short. What I found there shocked me. The culture was totally different from what I would expect from a corporate entity. It was a place that was crawling with nepotism. The sons of my predecessors worked at the place, and a senior executive's wife was a caterer who was a service provider to the company. So that particular story is told in this book, published by UJ Press, The Transformation and Turnaround of Employers Federation, SIFSA. It also came out this year. But more importantly, the entity was a loss-making entity. In that year, in 2013, when I joined, the board had approved a deficit budget. And in fact, corporate governance was totally absent. So I had the privilege, one, of turning the organization around to ensure that it ceased being a loss maker to generating profits. Two, I ensured that one introduced, so one's legacy at the entity was that one introduced a business culture at the organization. And of course, we got rid of any form of nepotism. And finally, I entrenched a culture of corporate governance. We're able to separate from an executive committee and a board with delegated authority to the CEO and the executive committee reporting to a board of directors. So those for me would be the main achievements at that organization. Regrettably, when COVID-19 hit, we struggled financially, and then there were very real opportunistic tendencies on the part of some on the board that led to a parting of ways. Because I'm not the kind of person who sits back and keeps quiet when something wrong happens. So I called out wrong behavior, and that regrettably led to a parting of ways. But as I said, that story is told in detail in this book. Thank you very much.
That was Kaizer Nyatsumba discussing his book, Corporate Newsman.